Thunder? How ominous. What a good way to start a video. Brothers, sisters, comrades, and friends, welcome once again to Bat Country. People have told me that I'm a little long-winded, professorial, you might say, so I'm going to try to keep this particular video relatively brief by my standards anyway. I've talked a lot already on this channel about my experiences with hallucinations, particularly alcoholic hallucinosis. We all have a framework for hallucinations. Most of us know what they are in some sense or another. But I've also talked a little bit about delusional thinking as a result of alcohol use disorder. So what is that? What does that mean? What is delusional thinking? What is a delusion? I think the best way for me to explain it concisely, as I would like to do in this short video, is to share an example of my own. So that's what we're going to do. At the end of my most recent relapse, I was trying to taper down back to sobriety. And it wasn't working. Due to the compounding effects of the repeated cycle of relapse and then withdrawal, my withdrawals are particularly bad, and it doesn't take very much for me to enter the phase of delirium tremens and acute alcohol withdrawal syndrome anymore. I want to tell you about this one particular experience I had, this one particular delusion. I've actually had more dramatic delusions in the past, more interesting delusions, including the one in which I walked into a German police station to inform them that my girlfriend had been kidnapped and was being used to extort money from me. None of that was true, but it caused the police to arrive at my doorstep a few days later to check everything was okay, and as a result of that, I am definitely on some kind of European watch list now. Anyway, I chose not to talk about that one. I chose to describe a simpler, more representative, more relatable delusion that I experienced, because I think that should give you a more realistic insight into what it's like to have delusions when you don't know something is wrong. At the point of this particular delusional period, I had been drinking extremely heavily for 2 or 3 weeks, morning to evening to blackout, hard liquor, non-stop. And then after the decision to stop, I was about 3 or 4 days into tapering, the process by which you consume lower and lower amounts of alcohol, or alcoholic drinks with a lower alcohol volume, over time until, in theory, you're consuming no alcohol at all. But after about 3 or 4 days, it was very obvious that that wasn't working for me, and I was beginning to hallucinate again. I was beginning to enter alcoholic hallucinosis, which is one of my biggest fears. And it became very obvious very quickly that I needed medical help. I had to go to a hospital. So I went. And I was put on a psych ward to detox, which is pretty standard. There, they gave me various benzodiazepines and some anti-anxiety medication and something to help sleep. And all of those medications, they helped to stop the hallucinations that I was experiencing at that time. But they didn't stop the delusional thinking. That continued unabated. So long story concise, that ward, that psych ward, is a deeply unpleasant and troubling and traumatic place, even at the best of times. Even if you're relatively healthy, it's just the worst place to possibly be. The lighting is oppressively bright. The food is deeply unnutritious. It's just bread and carbohydrates and cheese slices and old meat. It makes you feel unhealthy the more you put into your body. There's not enough coffee. There's not enough juice. The whole place smells of antiseptic and antibacterial cleaning fluids. Very, very overpowering. The walls seem to shrink the more time that you spend there. And you're not allowed out of the ward until you've been there for 5 days. So it's incredibly claustrophobic, more increasingly so as time goes by. Nothing to do. There's nothing to do, nothing to distract you. You just have to lie on that narrow hospital bed and stare at the ceiling, thinking you're going out of your mind as the minutes tick by. Oh, and one of the things that nobody tells you about acute alcohol withdrawal is that it makes you really horny. Like unstoppably horny. And a lot of your time on a psych ward in detox is devoted to addressing that, taking that issue in hand, so to speak. There's a lot of that on the psych ward. Is that too much information? Is that too much this time? I think it might be too much information. Sorry about that. But I started this channel to tell the ugly truth, and that is one of the ugly truths. It makes you really horny and you become sexually compulsive. Let's move on. Anyway, I'd been on that psych ward for about 3 days, I think, when I began to lose touch with reality. At that point, I hadn't had any sleep at all, nothing, for about 5 days. Insomnia is common with even mild withdrawal, but with acute alcohol withdrawal, there is just no sleep, never, at all, for days and days and days. It is torture. That alone would be enough to drive most people to the brink of insanity. But for people like me, who are there because we have already crossed the threshold into insanity, well, it just throws more fuel on the fire, I suppose. Coffee is life. I had a roommate on the ward, a big, capital D German guy. His name was Max. And he was in his late 50s and he spoke some English. And we got on really well. He was a nice guy. He was also there for an alcohol detox, and he'd been there for 3 weeks when I encountered him, when I moved into his room. And he was very grateful that I did, because he saw me as someone who was relatively sane, also just there for a detox, as opposed to a lot of the other people who were brought in kicking and screaming and violent and having various degrees of psychotic breaks. I was at least predictable to him, so he thought. Because he'd been there for 3 weeks, he was allowed to go out of the ward on a daily basis. So he would go out and go home. He lived nearby, or he might go and do some work on the side. I remember one day, one of the early days that I was there, I had to improvise some acting headshots for him because he worked as an extra in movies. He had a very, very strong face, a very tough-looking man. But he would disappear during the daytime and then come back in the evenings. At some point, a new guy was brought onto the ward by the cops, and he was spitting and swearing, strapped to a gurney. And that coincided with the time that my mind began to really unravel. And I began connecting bits of information that were not related and compiling them into sprawling conspiracies like the one I'm about to describe. But it's worth noting that at the time that guy was brought in, very violent, very clearly withdrawing from something very powerful and utterly psychotic. At that point, I was sliding quite deeply into delusion. And I am uncertain exactly how much of what follows really happened. As I said, this is not the most dramatic story, but it is representative. It's quite boring, actually, because it is... Ooh. The point is, I'm not sure how much of what I remember actually happened, but I'm going to relay it as I remember it. So this young man, he was younger than me. I remember he was wearing athletic wear. He was quite slim and tanned, Mediterranean perhaps, or Arabic in his ancestry. He was in quite bad shape. His skin was badly cracked. He had some lesions. And his skin kind of suggested maybe a heroin addiction or meth, maybe. But he wasn't beyond recovery. After he was eventually released from the gurney the next day, I encountered him a couple of times in this little smoking section, one of the few places we could break out to that wasn't directly on the ward. It was disgusting in there. The walls were sticky with nicotine. It was like the inside of a smoker's lung. And I would find him in there, and he was angry. And I remember that he was trying to get everybody else, all the other patients, riled up, as if the doctors were contravening our basic human rights. He was very angry about the fact that we couldn't just leave if we wanted to. And he was trying to foment a kind of uprising, to turn us against the doctors. I remember him asking if anybody on the ward had weed or alcohol, booze. And no one did. And he was angry about that too. And I remember him trying to bribe people who were allowed to leave into bringing back a bottle of whiskey or vodka or trying to smuggle some weed in. And that night, my roommate, Max, he didn't come back until quite late. He was excited when he came back in the room, and he had been to this audition, he told me about, the one that I'd done headshots for. And he was acting out his role in a very bellicose and very noisy manner, so that the nurses actually came in to check everything was okay because he was shouting. And I had the vague sense that he'd been drinking. And that triggered my anxiety very badly. And I'm already deeply in delusion. And now I'm struggling with anxiety too. The next morning, my roommate told me that the young man, the angry man who'd been brought in, had been removed from the ward because they had discovered him throwing a small party in his own room with alcohol and with weed. That conversation, I'm not sure, actually happened. Shortly after that conversation, in my mind at least, a young orderly that I hadn't seen before came in and did some very superficial cleaning of the room. He cleaned the desk that was over in the corner and he wiped down a chair. And I saw him look underneath my roommate's bed. And then I went out onto the ward and I noticed that there were some faces that I hadn't seen before. Some doctors were new, and all of the old team who had been there the previous day weren't there today. And I raised that with one of the nurses. I told her, I remember she was taking my blood pressure, and I remember saying, it seems very different here. There are lots of new faces. It seems very busy. Busier than normal. Is everything okay? In my mind, I'm trying to find information. Where are the old staff? Where did they go? Why aren't they here? Why is there a heightened sense of anxiety around the building? Of course, it was all in my mind. And she said to me, well, it's a very busy ward. People come and go, and the doctors work rotating shifts so that they're not on the ward for too long, because it's as traumatic for them as it is for us. I didn't believe her. I was deep into delusional thinking by now, and I had no idea that I was delusional. But a story materialized in my mind that my roommate had been bribed by the angry young man to smuggle alcohol back in, and they had drunk it together and been caught. And I could feel that story burrow into my mind and become real. It's very hard to explain. It was like osmosis. I could just feel the idea becoming true. I had fallen into that stereotypical trap of schizophrenic patients believing the staff are against them, the doctors are against me. I was connecting dots that shouldn't connect. I was connecting points of information that were completely disseparate, completely unrelated to each other. And my mind was somehow willing to just absorb it all without questioning the logic or without reconciling the contradictions. And I believed that that angry guy had smuggled drugs and alcohol onto the ward via my roommate. And he had been caught and expelled from the ward, and that all of the nurses had been fired as a result. And now the replacement nurses, the people who were still left over, were trying to cover the tracks so that they too wouldn't get fired. I told my roommate about this theory, and I warned him that somebody had come in and looked under the bed, which I am confident did happen. And even in that delusion, I trusted my roommate. I liked him. I was on his side, and I wanted him to be on my side. And I told him that an orderly had come in and snooped through his things, looking for evidence. Now, that conversation really did happen, but Max had no idea what I was talking about. I was talking about something outside reality. It must have been a very strange and confusing conversation with him as I increasingly tried to persuade him that he was in danger. He had no idea what I was talking about, but for me, it felt like the most important thing in the world. For a while, my whole world revolved around this weird conspiracy, and it was the only thing that mattered. The nurses were conspiring against us, the patients, to save their jobs by framing us for something. I was scared of that. I was scared. They felt like they were all powerful, and I had somehow punctured their conspiracy and seen the truth. And I was going to expose them. And at this point in the story, my mind was so out of control and so racked with paranoia that even my memory of it is untrustworthy. And there was a table in my room, and I sat down to write an account of everything that was happening in case I was murdered. There would be evidence for the police to expose this grand conspiracy after I had died. And I remember sitting at that desk, writing for hours. Every single little detail I could think of went into that piece of writing, or so I thought. It went into this notebook, which is what I had with me in the ward. But when I opened it later, this notebook, this is all I had written that day. It seems unfair to make such a beautiful notebook an account of such ugliness, but I am in an ugly place. It's hard to write, physically, I mean. I am heavily medicated, my brain foggy, and I haven't slept for so long I'm no longer sure I have ever been to sleep. And that's it. Hours and hours of writing. And that's all I've got. In my mind, I remember writing reams and reams of evidence, detailed and cross-referenced and research into this conspiracy. But I guess that simply never happened either. Even my delusion was delusional. And then at some point that night, I got very sick, for real. Someone had brought a norovirus onto the ward and I had picked it up. And I told the staff about it. And they came to check me a little later and they loaded me up with medication, which I was reluctant to take because I thought they were poisoning me. And they gave me medication so that hopefully I might sleep through this bout of nausea and vomiting and diarrhea. But I didn't. I became convinced that they had isolated my room. They had medicated me and closed my room off, and all the other patients had been moved to a different wing of the hospital, far, far away. I thought that I was completely alone in the hospital, and when I could hear clanking and noise in the corridor outside the room, I interpreted that to be patients being quietly moved without my knowledge, and that I was highly contagious and dangerous, and that I needed to be isolated, I needed to be quarantined, or rather, everyone needed to be quarantined from me. I thought I was completely alone in there. I didn't eat, I didn't move, I didn't sleep, except at the whims of my stomach bug. I didn't even leave my bed. Just a bag of sweat lying on that bed, dry heaving, and believing that the nurses had all fled the ward in fear, and that I had been left to die. And I accepted that. I was ready to die that night. And that's an insight into the delusional thought patterns that alcohol withdrawal can put you through. You can experience reality in an entirely different way. The strange thing about it is that I still believe all of it is true to this day. I still believe that everything just as I described it is real. And I also believe that it was a delusion. How do I explain this? Everything happened as I described it, and in the moment I believed it to be true, and looking back I remember it to be true, but I also know that it was not. Those two facts, that the experience I described really happened, and at the same time they were not real, those facts live side by side in my head. Alcoholic delusions can make you believe two completely contradictory, mutually exclusive things at the same time with no conflict. Okay, let's wrap it up. The more I think about withdrawal, the more it surprises me with its power to deceive your rational thinking processes. It can make you believe entirely opposite and contradictory things at the same time. And it goes on month after month, week after week. As always, comment with your experiences of delusional thinking. They are fascinating. and subscribe for other updates in the future. Thank you for watching. Keep coming back.